Welcome to Ask SME Anything. Your chance to ask the ITProTV subject matter experts questions live. Here's your host, Don Pizzette.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to Ask SME Anything, the show brought to you by ITProTV, where you, the viewer, get to ask questions to the subject matter experts from ITProTV. And in today's episode, we have Mr. Adam Gordon right here in the studio with us here to answer our questions. Adam, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
And I know we've had you on a couple of times now, but just for those of you watching that are out there, Adam's areas of specialty generally, well, you know, it's hard to say what you specialize in because you have so many different areas.
Stuff. I just tell people stuff.
Stuff. So, you know, a man with decades of IT experience in many fields, including security, Windows. He is our resident Azure, Microsoft Azure and System Center expert, as well as security. So definitely a wealth of knowledge, and you, the viewer, can ask questions directly to him a couple of different ways. If you're an ITProTV subscriber, you can go to itpro.tv, jump over to our Q&A forums, post your question there, and we prioritize and answer those questions here on the show. Those are the ones we get to first. Then we reach out to the old Twitter sphere. Out there on Twitter, you can post a question with hashtag AskSMeAnything. That's SME, like subject matter expert, AskSMeAnything. And we aggregate those together, and we answer as many of those as we can in the time allotted. And I know we said Adam's areas of expertise. If you have questions outside of that area, don't worry. You can ask those too. Maybe have ITIL questions. Well, we have a resident expert for that too, Miss Jo Peacock. She's not on the show right now, but she will be again soon. So we take those questions and we hold them until she's on the show and we get them answered. So feel free to throw out whatever questions you want, whether we're live, whether we're not. We do try to get to all of the questions and get them answered. All right, well, enough about that. Let's jump into our first question, kind of kick this thing off. Our first question is, this is one I actually hear a lot. This one came from Ryan out there via Twitter, and it is, what are the main concerns that I should have about managing cloud costs? And Adam, I know for a lot of people, cloud gives you access to infrastructure you don't normally have, but there's the big risk of, I don't know what my bill is going to be. So how do we get over that?
So it's one of the main risks. I think the biggest conversation point I tend to have with customers or students about this, the biggest thing we would focus on would be managing your information and knowing what you own, right? Because we talk about awareness as really being kind of the key to mitigating risk and to controlling things that potentially can get out of hand, cost being probably one of the most important ones. You know, in most of the recent cloud surveys, who is it? Gartner just put one out recently. Many of the cloud companies put them out roughly around the middle of the year about cloud adoption, cloud usage, things like that. In all the most recent studies, we're seeing an average trend upwards in terms of spend. The prototypical medium-sized organization is spending over $1 million a year on cloud services today, with a projected growth rate of double to maybe triple that over the next 3 to 4 years. And as a result, cost continues to be a central focus because of the spend rate that companies are dumping into this technology. You were mentioning it gives us access to things we don't have. It's not so much that we don't have them, but it's a question of how we redirect our need to use them, and we ultimately seek to manage them. And because we're giving third parties the ability to provide that on our behalf with cloud, and we do this kind of dance where we shift capital expenditure into operational expenditure, right? That's really kind of the magic that cloud transforms on our balance sheets. We think we do a great job, but the problem is we don't pay attention on a regular basis necessarily to what that expense line looks like. We just see it all up, as you were suggesting, dollar value, maybe at the end of the month. You know, a lot of recommendations would be things like, don't just take a look at the end of the month and hope your bill is going to be either kind of zeroed out and traditionally where you think it'll be, or perhaps within a certain narrowly defined window, but rather pay attention to it on an ongoing basis. Invest, in other words, in the infrastructure and the oversight capabilities that help you detect early the costs are on the rise and alert you to those things. Spending caps, right, are a great way to think about that. Maybe only enable certain services to a certain point and then have administrative override before you can continue to use them. These are ways that would typically allow us to control costs.
Now, I know in the early days when I got involved with AWS, it was a fear of mine, right? You know, maybe I spin up an instance and forget about it, and then all of a sudden I run up some crazy bill by the end of the month. And Amazon rolled out a cost explorer where you can actually see where it trends out, what your monthly bill is going to be. A lot of the other providers have started doing that too, but that that kind of solved the problem for a little while. Now we're hearing more and more companies going to multi-cloud deployments, right? We don't want, if Amazon goes down, we want our site to stay up, so we want to deploy on Azure and Amazon. Do you have any recommendations for people that have a more complex environment?
So there are freestanding or third party. When I say third party, I mean external to a single cloud provider, platform vendor, programs or tools that you can buy, you can invest in. Some of them are cloud based. So essentially you're using the cloud to monitor and manage the cloud, which is always ironic and fun. But a lot of them are available from many of the same providers that are giving you cloud services. Amazon itself doesn't necessarily provide a third party all up multi-platform tool. Microsoft does, in the sense that System Center is cross-platform capable for management and basic understanding of costs. So the System Center Virtual Machine Manager can cross-platform host, and some of the other extensions in System Center can look at things like System Center Ops Manager, for instance, things of that nature. But there are many third-party tools. The other thing that a lot of companies don't really understand the value of, or I think miss potentially the importance of with regards to management and documentation, is the ability to understand how to manage information, meaning the metadata we create around the VMs, the virtual machines, the infrastructure we create, using something as simple as tags, but enforcing and making ubiquitous the use of tagging to understand the nature of the infrastructure and the descriptors around how we use that infrastructure to allow us to understand if things can be turned off or at least can be constrained without impacting line of business capabilities is very, very important. You're talking about, in some cases, especially if we're failing through the cloud, one vendor to another, as you suggested, potentially losing sight of what infrastructure is and what it does, and not understanding whether we can affect that infrastructure to affect cost. And this is an issue. You mentioned, hey, I spun up an instance and I forgot about it, right, early on. Not harping on developers by any means when I say this, but we see a lot of that kind of behavior in development environments where multi-instances are spun up for a variety of reasons, testing, code development and deployment, QA, et cetera, and maybe not, unfortunately, turned off right when they should be. I think the bigger feature that's impacting that today, if you use it correctly, is while cost exploring is good, auto termination of the VM instance at a certain time, right? Calendaring that it will turn off, let's say maybe at 9 o'clock at night if you're not a 24/7 business. And that way you don't run these huge expenses overnight when things aren't necessarily in need, is also really important.
Now, I want to double back to something you mentioned where you said like using the cloud to monitor the cloud. And it sounds funny, but is that a problem we need to worry about? Should we make sure that our monitoring system, if it's cloud-based, should we bring in a third cloud provider, or should we have an on-prem, or is that just not a significant enough problem to worry about?
So, it's interesting, right? Because there are two ways to go. You can say, well, if one cloud provider fails, it's unlikely, relatively speaking, unlikely that all cloud providers would fail. But then you have to worry about, did you make the right choice? Are you with the right provider, the one that isn't going to be affected? But I mean, that's the same logic if you have it on-prem, right? Am I going to be affected? Perhaps the on-prem internal land-based environment is up and running because of disaster recovery and business continuity capabilities. You have power generation, things like that. So you're running, but maybe your internet provider, the circuits are down. You can't get out of your little cubbyhole to get to the remainder of your infrastructure. So there's pros and cons with going on-prem versus being in the cloud. If you can't get out of your premise or your environment, but the cloud is still functioning, you can relocate to somewhere else to get online, in theory, as long as circumstances allow for that. Or you can have pre-deployed either resources such as people and or other partners that may be able to do this on your behalf. It's a very different world today than it was, let's say, 15, 20, 30 years ago when the cloud first started to emerge. And we really had to make choices about, I'm going to put this little segment of things in the cloud because I don't trust it and it's not vital to my business. And I'm going to keep all the really important stuff here and I'm going to safeguard it. We were chatting just before we came on about the fact that more and more today, it's very unlikely that you see people doing on-prem deployments for things that we would take for granted 10 years ago. Messaging systems, right? I mean, show me people that are building Exchange messaging systems from the ground up today to manage them on-prem, exclusive of the cloud. While they exist, it's very different today, and it's usually not the first go-to solution. We usually think cloud perhaps in a hybrid solution, if not first, and all the numbers indicate the trend to that. So I think it's interesting. My preference would be that I would always want to have a non-cloud-based option because I do think there still are significant liabilities, even though we spread them across multiple vendors and in some cases very significant vendor platforms. There still are indications that things can go horribly wrong. And when they do, it's nice to know that we can still rely on infrastructure that we actually maintain and control ourselves.
All right. Well, I know I got you off on a bit of a tangent, but the short answer to the question was, if you're concerned about cost, look for things like spending limits or spending caps, whatever they're called in your provider, alerts. There's typically systems like that in place, and that'll help you to curtail your costs. All right. Well, let's move on to the next question, which I also believe came to us via hashtag Ask SME Anything. This one is about a little bit of news that's been out there from Tyler in the Twitter sphere. He asked, AT&T acquiring AlienVault. Why do I care?
Well, if you work for AlienVault and you are part of that company from the very beginning, you may care because you may stand to make money. But I think more importantly, from my perspective, and I think it's a great question, this is something that came up this week, actually, right? So we are in the middle of July, and this was announced early in the week. I think it's interesting, and from my perspective, and I think for a lot of IT professionals, we've seen evidence of this across multiple acquisitions. Microsoft recently discussed and announced the fact they would be acquiring GitHub, and that's only the latest, but certainly there have been many spectacular acquisitions over the last several years. The good and upside of acquisitions are if the company gets it right and the acquisition and the integration is good, then customers as well as partners stand to benefit, right? And AT&T is one of the biggest technology companies in the world, and they're acquiring AlienVault because they want to build up their services arm specific to computer security, threat mitigation, threat intelligence, all things that AlienVault is really built a reputation around. And I think it's great, but I as many of my colleagues and peers are a little concerned about the fact that if AT&T, because of its size and the fact that it doesn't have depth in this area, so it's buying and acquiring a company to build that depth, if they screw up the integration and they don't understand how to manage the asset, customers as well as partners that rely on AlienVault for some really significant things can potentially come out on the negative side or downside of this. So, it's like anything else. There's upside, but there's also risk. And we've seen it go well. We've also seen it go horribly wrong, right, over the years, depending on the companies involved.
So when I first saw this article, I started kind of scratching my head trying to figure it out, because normally it's some acquisition that makes sense. Like when Cisco bought Aeronet way back in the day, it made sense. They were a networking company. They wanted wireless networking. There you go. AT&T, mostly a communications company. And then they buy this vendor who makes a very robust security platform. And for our viewers who aren't familiar with AlienVault, it does log aggregation, intrusion detection. It also does vulnerability scanning. It's like a whole security platform for securing your company. And at first I thought, well, AT&T, they're not the name that comes to mind when I think of, I need somebody to help me secure my network. So maybe it's that they're an AlienVault customer and that their bill is so big, it's cheaper to just buy the company. But it would make sense. They do a ton of small business work. And if that's what they're offering out as a service, it'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I think it can be good. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of downside if they get it right. There's a lot of upside. But I know there's been a lot of concern since the announcement that because of their track record, them being AT&T, let's just say not the most stellar of track records when it comes to acquiring and integrating technology verticals, that there is some concern, all kidding aside, that because they don't have knowledge and depth in this area, they're buying into this silo. That's really the play here, right? They're buying this company to create a footprint to be competitive with companies like Dell and HP that are global companies that offer these services and have track records in these areas. They're trying to go head-to-head with them. And buying into the market is good if you really have a strategy. It's just unclear what the strategy is besides let's buy the established company and hope we don't run it into the ground, right? Which may or may not be a good strategy. We'll see.
Now, I've interviewed the team over at AlienVault, I think on 2 different occasions, but I've never actually used their product in a production environment. Have you ever encountered it out there in the wild?
I have customers that do. I have a very good friend of mine who, full disclosure, does work for AlienVault as one of their subject matter experts. Somebody who was actually the technical editor on one of the CIS's PCBK books that I did for ISC Squared. So it's a great company, great product, great set of products. Great suite is probably a better way of describing it, as you suggested, but not for every company. It is a complex solution and one that requires, while it is not rocket science by any means, it's a very straightforward solution, requires a really good understanding of your capabilities versus the platform and what you're looking to do from a roadmap perspective to really gain value out of it. But it is a very, very robust solution.
And they have a cool conference booth. There's always a spaceship and all
They
that.
do.
So.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that was another question that came to us via hashtag Ask SME Anything. So I want to remind you all out there that if you have questions beyond the ones that we're answering already, feel free to throw them out there, even live right now during the show. Our social media team is monitoring that channel so we can try and get those questions in. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question, which is going to jump us out. This one's from Robert via hashtag Ask Me Anything. It is, where I work, we use a lot of group policies. Will this slow our system? Is there a sweet spot or a number we should limit ourselves to? And I've heard this before in some of the classes where I've taught, and I've described commercial environments where I've worked where we might have had up to 50 different group policy objects that apply to a single user device combination, right? So people inquire about this, like how should I keep my GPOs small and have a lot of them? Should I have one that's really big? Does it even matter? How does that work out?
So it does matter, and there definitely is a methodology. So should we say, or so we say. The general rule of thumb is less is more, right? In the sense that what we want and what we have to be aware of here is the way in which group policies are processed and ultimately applied, and the timing associated with application of group policies. Most of you have probably seen at some point, if you work in environments with policies, and they're as crazily big and large as perhaps Don was describing, where you go to log on and you get the spinning kind of vortex of nothingness, right? That's happening while you're waiting for the logon prompt to kind of go from I type my credentials to, hey, let me say I'm about prepared and then let me get my desktop. What's happening during that hopefully brief, but potentially span of time is several things. Your credentials are being sent across the network, coming back, being authenticated. You're being authorized if you are properly allowed to authenticate. But once that happens, policies are being applied to the machine and you as a user vis-a-vis the machine. And your environment is being crafted as a result and essentially sculpted so you can then log in and use it with the proper oversight the policy provides. If you have a whole series of very small policies, when I say small, I mean doing one or two things, but you have 20 to 30 of them that have to be lined up and processed in order to get to that point, that's one approach. You could have one or two large policies, maybe one for all things user, one for all things computer as two categories that do a bunch of stuff. However you get there, we still have to process all the settings in each one of those policies and then figure out how to apply them. And there's multiple levels that policies can exist at. There's a local machine policy. There is then the all-up forest level policy for the entire organizational structure. We don't tend to do much there, but there is a policy in theory that can exist there. There then is going to be one or more policies that exist at the domain level, which is where we traditionally see almost all, if not all, of our settings. Certainly all security-related settings will be applied there. And then there may be one or more policies that can exist at an OU or a container level based on organizational structure within the directory. And these policies have to be applied in order, and they may cross-reference and or cancel each other out. And we have to worry about all the complexities of that and get all that right within a very short period of time. If we take more than about 9 to 10 minutes, we actually time out and cannot log in. There is a hard-coded value for that at the end of the day. So there's a lot of complexity we have to manage here. The best practice over time, since probably the beginning of time with policies on the Windows side anyway, which goes back to the advent of Windows 2000 and our current LDAP-based directory structure, has been to try to have less policies but have more things in those policies if possible so that we can apply them. But the problem becomes if policies get too bulky or large in general, they may take too long to apply. And so instead of just saying have fewer policies but shove a bunch of stuff in them, as opposed to a lot of small policies, really the best way to think about this is try to come up with an exacting list of things you actually want to accomplish through policy, and then see if there are ways to accomplish them. And if those things can be accomplished by group policy, definitely good to think about pursuing them. But are there other ways we can accomplish the same thing that are not policy-based? In other words, can we educate users about certain things instead of enforcing a policy to require they do that? And if we can eliminate some of the things in a policy, we can streamline that process, and then we can optimize performance as well as management and oversight. And so it becomes almost a cost-benefit analysis and a trade-off. But there definitely is a tipping point. There is such a thing as having too many policies, and there is such a thing as policy complexity that can actually weigh us down and prevent us from getting to where we need to be. Tools like resultant set of policies so that we can run through and see what the outcome of policy application will be, what those settings are and how they will appear as well as impact to the user and the machine are valuable and should be explored because they are really important.
You know, you mentioned tools, and it kind of made me think. Like, let's say I'm a system administrator. I've got a series of policies, right? Maybe I have 10 policies with one setting each. And then I say, well, you know what, let me try kind of consolidating this, having one policy with 10 settings all together. And I want to measure the amount of time it takes to apply that policy. Now, with resultant set of policy, I can see the settings, but I don't necessarily see the time. And when you boot a computer, it doesn't really tell you there either. Do you know any way of measuring like how much time is actually spent applying the group policy objects?
So, you know, it's interesting. I don't know of a specific tool that will give you that. I'm sure there is one out there. Having said that, I'm sure somebody out there probably heard that and said, well, what about this? And if you know what it is, please do send it in and tell us, because I'm sure there is something. I don't doubt there is. I know that there are some benchmarking tools that can do a variety of things, but I haven't seen one specific to policy execution. But I know that what we can do is we can look at log files with regards to the application of policies on the machine, and we can get a general idea of the time range it takes to apply the policy. But it's a very convoluted process because it's not easy to go and say, okay, this policy took this long, because you have to track the policy identifiers in order to be able to figure out the GUIDs, right? To figure out what policies are being applied. Every policy has a unique identifier associated with it. I'm sure somewhere buried in the metadata and the properties of the policy, there's probably a way, I would think maybe with WMI, maybe with WQL to query with WMI or CIM to query. There may be a way to query the object class and find an identifier based on the time it takes, but it has to be done probably server side, I would think, and it may be tough to get. I wouldn't know of a way off the top of my head.
Yeah, I was just doing a quick skim through Microsoft's knowledge base, and they were showing using XPerf to like measure the boot time, but that doesn't tell you like specifically what's GPO
policy specific. Though it just gives you general parameters.
And it might even be a tricky thing to measure because you have your computer policy and your user policy. They're applied at two different times, so you'd really have to be able to measure that as well.
Although, as I said, you're right, but there is a unique identifier per policy, right? Mm-hmm. So you, in theory, if you could find a way to track that string, you may be able to figure out execution time based on information in the logs. Yeah. If I had to guess, and I had to sit down and really put some time into it to figure it out, that's the route I would start with, because that's probably, if there is a tool that's doing it, it's probably how they're doing it. I just don't know if there's a way to get that done. Yep. But you know what? With PowerShell, who knows? Because you could rule the world with PowerShell.
There you go. So if you're an aspiring entrepreneur with development skills, here's a tool you could create that would revolutionize the world of GPO performance troubleshooting.
There you go.
All right. Well, Adam, that was a good one. And you know, actually, I said when we read that question that it came from Twitter. That one actually did come from the ITProTV forums.
Right? Yeah.
So let me remind everybody that if you have a question, you are welcome to post on Twitter using hashtag Ask SME Anything. But if you're an ITProTV subscriber, you can post to those forums like Robert did, and we prioritize those. We make sure that they do get answered during the show. So
good job, Robert. Good question.
All right, let's move on to what is our next question. All right, this one is, what is the BankBot Anubis malware, and why should I be worried about it? Yet another malware. They do start to all blend together. So, Adam, is this one significant or more worrisome than others?
So it's from my perspective, it's interesting. It's a derivative of some of the other malware that's out there in terms of attacks. So it's not brand new by any means. It's kind of a branch of some stuff that's been going on for a while. But I think it's significant, and I think Connor is right when he or she, whoever Connor is, hits it on the head and says, hey, should I be worried about this? I would be, and I'll tell you why, at least from my perspective. This particular branch of malware has been attacking users over in Turkey. It's been limited to that area of the world so far. We haven't seen it spread, although there is indications that it could easily be modified and morph to spread to areas around the world. But it's scary for a couple of reasons. Number one, the complexity involved in the command and control infrastructure behind this malware indicates that it's most likely a criminal syndicate or element that is doing this as a service, as opposed to maybe just an individual or a small group that's just looking to extort and maybe target, quick hit and run, right, kind of stuff that we sometimes see. So number one, that's very concerning. IBM's X-Force, which is the arm of IBM that does a lot of the research in many of these areas, among many other entities that do this kind of work, put out a really great report. This is, today is what, July 11th, right? So earlier in the week, around July 8th, July 9th, July 10th, they put out a report on this malware, which you can find if you're interested in going back, taking a look at. Talks a lot about some of the details I'm going to share with you now. But they're very concerned about the fact that the command and control infrastructure allows this bot to download over 1,000 different varieties of the malware as it is brought into the machines that are infected with different unique MD5 hashes and signatures, over 95% of which don't currently show up in virus scans, meaning the average AV systems out there and malware systems out there don't recognize over 90% of the current signatures that are being used to drive this malware. VirusTotal, VirusScan, a lot of the online engines have almost no record of this, which is scary for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons we say that potentially this thing could easily jump ship and morph into different varieties that may attack other areas. The other scary thing about this is that it's being propagated through the Android Play Store, i.e. Google, right? And over 10 applications have currently been found that we're able to get into the Play Store and distribute this malware undetected for what looks like a very significant period of time because of the fact that this is not the traditional approach. This is not malware packaged up as an application. This is an application that is using a Trojan, if you will, to simply get you to be redirected and download the malware from a command and control infrastructure that sits outside of the chain. And as a result, the scanners are not picking up the applications and seeing them as problematic. And they've come in under the guise of banking applications, online e-commerce shopping applications, automotive care and parts applications, variety of things that people would download and look at and go, oh, that's probably something I need. My friend said I should use that. I'll use that. And now they're being infected. So it's scary for a lot of reasons. It takes a lot of thought, a lot of energy, a lot of time to design a system that does all these things this way. And that's why the indicators are that it's probably something that's being marketed as a service for long term as opposed to short term hit and run gain. So scary on a lot of fronts.
All right, now I'm going to ask a question here, which might turn what would normally be a 30-minute show into a 30-hour show.
Right.
But if I'm a system administrator and I hear about malware like this that is not being picked up by antivirus, and I'm responsible for protecting thousands of computers, all right, how am I supposed to protect against something like that? Is this where like application whitelisting would come in, or what kind of solutions are out there to help us protect from something that our AV or IDS just isn't even picking up?
Sure. So there are several things. Application whitelisting is certainly a really good idea, but the problem we tend to run into with this, right, is that it's very difficult to whitelist all the things that ultimately over time, kind of rolling through a typical enterprise environment, we may have better capability and control in the enterprise to whitelist. It becomes impossible to whitelist for an individual at home just because, there's really no way to keep up with it. It's a very good idea. It's very hard to execute. I think it's also hard in the enterprise environment because we tend to have a lot of things that people need to do, and sometimes it's hard to allow for all of them in that way. So it may be one element, but I would not say it's the primary go-to element. I think the bigger, broader thing we have to think about is why are we allowing corporate owned assets to be able to access and use non-corporate approved application stores and non-corporate approved applications in general. I understand if somebody on their own cell phone that may on occasion be used to make a phone call for the business or look at a spreadsheet or an email or whatever, but it's essentially a privately owned asset. I understand why that is certainly something we can't necessarily control in mobile device management software the same way we would on the corporate side. But your laptop, my desktop, there's not a compelling argument that any customer has been able to give me in 30 plus years and that I would accept as being valid that would allow me as a security professional to understand why you have a compelling reason to download an app from the Google App Store onto a corporate asset without first seeking approval and validating the application through testing. I think it's a question of awareness. I think it's a question of political will and policy. We talk about it at a high level, often using terms like due care and due diligence, right, to describe corporate and senior management oversight and alignment with requirements and policy, and then execution at the tactical and operational levels from the frontline professionals doing those things in alignment to support those requirements. It's easy to say those things. It's hard to make a policy that actually plays well in the real world and is going to produce the results you want without inconveniencing users beyond a reasonable level. I totally understand that. But I think the mitigation concerns we have around this kind of behavior outweigh the need for the ease of use that a user is going to complain about if we can't figure out a better way. But that's my opinion. That's not necessarily what everybody will feel is appropriate.
Yeah, I know Microsoft, and you might know more about this than I do, or probably know more about this than I do. Microsoft rolled out an enterprise management feature or whatever for their Windows Store. so that you could have Windows laptops deployed in your enterprise environment, and your end users would have access to a Windows store that would have just the apps that you selected in it, and
Corporate-owned app store.
Even your corporate side-loaded apps would be available there. So it gave you that control. I don't know if Apple or Google ever did anything similar.
Nothing on a commercial level, nothing to rival that, certainly. And, it makes sense in one respect, right? I mean, the 90+%, whatever it is today, even now, of the world in terms of the desktops in corporations are Microsoft-centric, whether we like it or not. That's just the reality we live with. So it makes sense they would be the leader in this area because they have the bulk of the responsibility, but also the bulk of the exposure. I think one of the interesting trends, we were talking about this right before we got on for the show, is this move continuing towards the idea of let's manage something for you as a service in the cloud via application and software providers like Microsoft. Operating system as a service, right? Application as a service. The idea that you're seeing more and more of this, and that indeed it's becoming, I won't say harder, but it's becoming less likely that corporate entities will choose to go the route of figuring out how to implement and manage their own infrastructure exclusive of the cloud. I think there's some interesting opportunities with that in mind to think about ways to create solutions that allow us to control for this. Platforms like System Center, platforms like OpenView, platforms like Spiceworks, whatever they may be, whatever vendor it is, whether it's cloud-based, hybrid, whatever, they allow us to really reach in and in unprecedented ways control every aspect of not only configuration, but of ongoing management, maintenance, configuration, monitoring, configuration, deployment, configuration, integration is all continuous now. And as a result, we can see immediate deviation. But that doesn't solve the original problem we identify, which is, okay, if I know it's bad, I can tell you it's bad. If I think it's good and I don't know it's bad and it's there, I still don't have a really good way of figuring that out. That is a fundamental gap in our armor, and it's been there forever. I don't think it's going to go away, only because even if you buy into this idea, and I know you hate the term I'm about to utter, so I will ask for forgiveness afterwards, but bear with me. Even if you buy into this idea of artificial intelligence, right, which is one of Don's key buzzwords, I define it a little bit differently and obviously more narrowly than many people will. And you and I have talked about the broad inanity of using the term without understanding it. But even if you buy into this idea of either machine learning or business intelligence or smarter systems that can think quicker and understand more because they aggregate more than a human can on the spot, which is what I would say is what we need to apply to this problem. Even if you bring that kind of technology to bear, heuristic analytics is what we talk about in the AV space with this. If you do that, there's a limit to understanding what's bad, even with a computer thinking it through, because they have no point of reference to recognize it as bad. The computer's not going to make the leap of faith and say, I think it's bad, because it has no better point of reference than we do for understanding that until behavior proves to the contrary that it is bad. There is some interesting stuff being done out on the edges of research around this problem. Quantum computing may change the way we deal with these issues in certain respects. Traditional thought processes about infection vectors will change. But you know what? There's always going to be a bright man or woman out there who figures out a better way to get that software into our systems before we get wise to it. I think the churn rate on the time it takes to discover is getting lower. So as a result, we're seeing less infections taking their time and walking 6, 9, 8, 12 months through a system before we find them. But I also think that is as much a function of the fact that people get bored by what they download and move on to new things as it is anything else. So it's human nature, I think, more than anything else, that is at the heart of the problem.
You know, I heard a really interesting scenario. This isn't really a question, but I'm going to throw it in anyway, which was somebody was telling me they felt really bad about people who worked in human resources, right? So if you're in HR and there's a job posting, people are emailing you resumes. A lot of those resumes are sent out in PDFs. So it's your job to open up PDFs from complete strangers.
And effectively, potentially infect your system.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah. And here we're talking about HR employees, people who have access to sensitive information, and we're effectively requiring them to open up these documents that are high-risk documents. Like that position right there, no amount of training can kind of overcome that hurdle, and that's part of the challenge of securing networks that we see today. It's a tough one.
It is. You know, I'll tell you one solution that has proved to be, I think, not only valuable but actually very pliable and plausible. Although it's difficult to implement and it's costly and it requires a level of complexity and management of complexity of infrastructure that many companies just are not willing to entertain. But VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, Zen Desktop, if you're a Citrix fan, Microsoft's VDI solution, VMware's Horizon View solution, whatever it is, if you're essentially running a virtual instance as opposed to an actual machine, that is part of the solution. But what takes us to the next level is a combination of VDI instances that are baselined and locked down from an image perspective. So no additional software can be brought into them without prior approval, along with the fact that those VDI instances are then wiped out and recreated on the fly as you regenerate them and need them. And all information is not resident in the VDI, because the nature of VDI is whatever data you create and store is actually stored outside and is pulled back in afterwards for the user based on a profile. If you use that kind of a system, you can avoid these issues on the corporate side. But it becomes difficult when you have remote users. Becomes difficult when we talk about integrating, as we said, personally owned and personally managed devices. There's no middle ground here. Either you're draconian and your users hate you, but they're secure, or you operate like most companies do, and you just hope that they're not going to do something that exposes you unnecessarily. And if they do, you try to figure it out as quickly as possible.
Just keep that positive attitude and hope for the best.
Exactly.
All right. Well, speaking of the best, let's go back out to our viewers and see what our next question is. This one is, looks like also from hashtag Ask Me Anything. Tom is asking, new technology spotlight. What is typingdna? So I'm going to second Tom here. I've never heard of typingdna. So can you tell us about it, Adam?
So I can, and I know it is actually, for me, it's kind of a cool thing. It's something interesting. So it falls into one of the two categories of biometrics that we often talk about. We have physiological and behavioral categories for biometrics. This is something that represents the behavioral aspect of biometrics. So it is the opportunity for us to combine keystroke or keyboard dynamics, where you're typing and we're monitoring how you type, along with multi-factor authentication, so that we can look at the way you type and use that to then drive one-time authentication or one-time passcode generation that's unique to you based on your typing pattern. That's kind of the high-level gist of it. But I also recommended and suggested to Don that maybe we could bring up the product page real quick and just show what this is, because it is kind of cool, and you may want to just take a look at it and see it.
I've got it pulled up here on my computer.
Okay, cool.
It's up
All
on
right, so
mine.
just while Don is bringing that up, there we go. So you could see, they call it frictionless authentication, but basically it's authentication based on how you type. You go through and you're able to go and you register. When you register, you go through a quick little provide us your email and set up and type this little registration paragraph kind of thing. And it goes through and does all that. Now, the thing you have to think about with this is it's limited to you on your machine. So if you are going to use multiple machines, you have to register and create separately a new quote-unquote user profile on each machine, because the typing pattern by keyboard will change. So Don right now, you can't see him, but he's typing on an external keyboard to the laptop. And if he was to then switch to the laptop keyboard, the registration, the false registration, or meaning the use of the keyboard, will change, and as a result, the false negative or false positive ratios can be skewed by the fact you're typing on different systems. So you do have to be aware of that, and they do tell you that, by the way. But in addition, they have extensible APIs, so you can actually integrate this into your own application, which is kind of cool. And they work with just about any online vendor that offers authentication. So you can integrate into AWS, into Coinbase, into Bitbucket, into Facebook. There's a whole bunch of them that have integration solutions for this. So it's an up-and-coming item, but it is kind of cool.
So I typed the same thing in the top and the bottom box just to kind of see and
you see, you can see kind of the match there, or the lack of match there that they're talking about.
It's kind of close if you look at them, but they are different. And I used my physical laptop keyboard on one. I switched to my remote,
right.
And I think I made a mistake on one and had to correct it. So it's interesting that it's picking up on that. So we had heard about a similar technology. Actually, it might have even been this one that was how you type, but it was also other things that were around you, like when you would use a camera to see like how you sat down or walked away from the computer, like even gathered more data than that.
That's probably not this, because this doesn't do that. This is really limited specifically to how you're typing and where you're typing, what keyboard you're on. But yeah, I've heard of other systems that do integrate additional environmental factors, the environment behind you, that kind of thing, where you position yourself, like you were suggesting. There's actually another interesting one as well, which I probably have mentioned at some point in other shows, which is, and I've actually seen this in a couple of military installations. They call it a gait sensor, not gait, G-A-T-E, but G-A-I-T, how you walk, as in the gait you walk. This was in one of the Mission Impossible movies, actually, where one of the levels of security that the character had to go through to get into the secure vault, it required them to walk down what looked like a people mover ramp, and there were X-rays machines on either side. And you saw, the skeletal walking frame of how they were doing this. But there actually are systems that do this, that look at how you walk, register the unique pattern, because apparently it is unique, and can use that as a biometric behavioral element to actually authenticate you in highly secure systems. So it's fascinating, the kind of stuff they're doing today.
Yep, everything that was in Minority Report is slowly coming true, and
slowly but surely,
we'll get there one day. I'm just waiting for the precogs.
Yes.
And then, yes. All right. Well, Adam, we do have one more question to get to. I think we have just enough time for it.
Cool.
So this one is kind of a funny headline that was being batted around this week. And it is centered around something the DoD did. So the question is, why does the U.S. Department of Defense move to bring back Clippy to help classify data and control access raise concerns?
So you may have fond memories of Clippy. Those of you that know Clippy will have fond memories of Clippy, hopefully. Office 95 and 97. I think it was 97, not 95, where he made his debut. But, if you don't remember Clippy or don't know Clippy, Clippy was one of the animated tools that Microsoft put out in Office at some point. It was literally an animated talking paperclip. That's where the name came from. That would offer suggestions, helpful suggestions to you about how to do certain things. And it had a friendly kind of googly-eyed look and would talk out of the side of its mouth, so the part of the paperclip would kind of move. And it talked in dialogue balloons.
I've got a picture pulled up on my computer.
If you want to put the picture up just so you can see what it was. So, there you go, exactly. So, it was a fun, cool little thing at the time. It didn't survive too many iterations, but it did certainly exist for a while. And it was helpful at the time. I think the challenge with the DoD looking to go to this, and to be fair to the DoD, before we incorrectly specify that they've done certain things, they weren't looking to necessarily bring back Clippy per se, but what they were doing was put out an RFI, request for information, a tender through DISA, to go out to the vendor community, their partner community, and look for partners that would be willing to get into a conversation with them about developing and offering a solution, either building one or one that may already be built, that would be Clippy-like. Essentially. Somebody, I think, somewhere in the narrative branded it as Clippy, and that stuck. And so everybody was saying, oh, look, they're going to try to bring back Clippy. But the idea was really they want a solution that will allow them to classify, when I say them, I mean a user in a secure environment inside the DoD, to be able to classify information, because what they're finding is they're struggling with classification, the ability to understand how to specify the data has to be certified at a certain level and therefore authorized for access to only people at a certain level based on the content or various attributes of the data. And they have systems that do this. This is not news. It's been going on forever. You're probably familiar with things like top secret, secret, eyes only. These are all levels of classification in one form or another. The problem is that many users struggle with how to classify data. Is this truly top secret? I'm just not sure, based on a variety of things. And so the tender was really around this idea of, can we seek to give guidance to people that are doing this, and can we somehow automate this process? I think the concern would be, if we're going to truly automate the process, take the human out of the mix, does the system, is it smart enough, does it know enough to be able to classify data correctly, or will it inadvertently classify data incorrectly, perhaps locking out users that belong seeing the data, to the benefit and to the the astuteness of DISA and the DoD. When you read through the material in the RFI and really truly look at the specifications they've called for, they've addressed what would be on my hit list of concerns around this. They've said, you know what, this is not a totally autonomous system. This is going to be an add-on system that will help and recommend to the user, but will not be relied upon solely. The user will ultimately have ultimate discretion. In other words, number two, they don't want it to be built into the operating system from the ground up, because they understand that that's probably very insecure and highly impractical. What they want instead is some sort of modular capability that could be augmented, but then can be tightly controlled and locked down to only run in certain environments. So they're eliminating a lot of potential weaknesses that may occur. They're also very narrowly defining and targeting a group of applications and the data created by it for application-centric use, Microsoft-centric, things like Exchange for email, SharePoint for enterprise content management, Microsoft Office. That's where the Clippy thought process probably came back in. But they're also looking at non-standardized data types. So binary data, MIDI streams, video, audio, things like that. So non-traditional data that would be archived, perhaps stored somewhere that does have to be classified. And then as a result of classification, having the ability to then add access control and implement access control as part of that process. It's actually a pretty interesting idea, and I think they've hit most of the high marks around mitigating risk and concern with the RFI. I think the challenge becomes, can they find a vendor that can integrate this in a timely fashion and actually do it in a way that makes sense? I think that's the broader issue.
Yeah, and this is all just designed to help that human element, right? That's the weakest link in security. So if they can better classify documents, this will take care of it.
Now, an interesting take on this, totally separate from what we're talking about, but there is another system that the DoD has used for some time. You may or may not be aware of this, but you will probably find this interesting. Something called Secure View. You ever heard of Secure View?
No.
So, we talk about virtualization environments and things like that. A Secure View is another DoD solution that exists. It is used on the virtualization and cloud stacks. And what it does is it allows the entire platform, the whole system being used to access the virtual environment, to be color-coded. So depending on the classification level of the infrastructure, the keyboard and all of the elements change colors on these Secure View systems. It's actually really cool technology. So highly classified systems typically are red more often than not. So the keyboard and everything and all the, not just the keyboard, but the individual keys that are active in the context of the window and the function they represent will turn red. It's obviously a highly specialized system. You have to buy the entire thing. You don't hook up a normal laptop and suddenly it develops LED capabilities. But in these environments, these are built this way. They've got about 5 or 6 colors that they use: green, red, yellow, depending on the classification level. And the entire system, including the edges of the monitor, are going to go this color, so VM to VM, area to area, window to window, context to context, because oftentimes you have multiple systems up. You know exactly what you're doing at all times visually. It's actually a really neat system.
Is that tied to a particular operating system, or are they doing more than one?
It is, I want to say that it is available in more than one, as far as I know. But it's actually pretty cool.
It shows what you can achieve with near limitless budget.
Absolutely. Your tax dollars at work.
Hey, as long as it's effective, I don't mind so much. But all right, well, Adam, speaking of being effective, that was the last question that we had in our queue for the show, so it's a pretty good spot for us to wrap up. I want to thank you for appearing on the show with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And for you viewers out there, I want to thank you not just for watching, but also for sending your questions in. If you didn't send your question in, be sure you do, right? Remember, you can jump out to Twitter, post your question on there, do a hashtag Ask SME Anything. We monitor that and bring it onto the show so our subject matter experts can answer that. Also, if you're an ITProTV subscriber, jump over to our website, go to the Q&A forums. You can post your questions there. We prioritize those and answer them here in the show. We make sure we get to those first before jumping over to the Twitter ones. Also, if you want to learn more about all the various things that Adam talked about, be sure to check out the ITProTV courseware library. We have tons and tons of content. Adam, what did we finally work out? You have over 500 hours of content in our library now, which is a near obscene amount of information to pour out of one man's head.
Growing by the day.
But he's done it, and you're growing every single day. So be sure to jump over there if you want to learn more about System Center, if you want to learn more about CISSP, security. VMware, yeah, absolutely. We have new VMware content coming up just here in a few months, so definitely be sure to check that out. We hope to see you there. But in the meantime, this is a good spot for us to wrap it up. So signing off for ITProTV's Ask SME Anything, I'm Don Pizzette.
I'm Adam Gordon.
And we will see you next time.
Take care, everybody.